Thank you, Community Housing Aotearoa and all others with responsibility for putting this meeting together. I'll speak for about 10 minutes and then I'll hand over to my colleague who's in the room, V. You will be in her capable hands. So just briefly from my desk, here in the Human Rights Commission, we are adopting what we call a holistic approach to human rights, meaning that we look at the whole spectrum of human rights, which includes civil rights and political rights, which are largely found in the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. But the Human Rights Commission is not only looking at civil rights and political rights, we're also looking at workers' rights, we're looking at social rights, looking at cultural rights, looking at the right to a safe environment, and looking at the rights of Indigenous peoples, and running throughout are the principles of non-discrimination and equality. So we're adopting this holistic vision of human rights, which is the vision in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's also a vision which resonates with Te Tiriti o Waitangi. It's a vision that is which is affirmed by the various treaties that New Zealand has signed up to. So we have this broad vision. Within this broad, holistic understanding of human rights, there are social rights. And one key social right is what the international treaties call the right to adequate housing. But when here in Aotearoa, I and my colleagues talk about the right to adequate housing, frankly speaking, very few people know what on earth we're talking about. They think that we've made it up. Well, we haven't made it up. The New Zealand government, successive New Zealand governments for decades have agreed to do all within their power to implement the right to adequate housing. And yet we have this problem of the invisibility of this fundamental human right, the right to adequate housing. We have this problem of the invisibility of the right to adequate housing in Aotearoa. So the Human Rights Commission has decided to try and elevate this human right in Aotearoa, we've decided to try and make it more visible and more widely understood in Aotearoa, but not just as a sort of bumper sticker, not just as a rhetorical flourish, but we want to raise the profile of the right to adequate housing and also show that it has depth, that it has something constructive to say to policymakers. It has a constructive role to play for communities and individuals working in this space, in the housing space. So how do we elevate the right to adequate housing in Aotearoa? How do we clarify what it means so that people know that it's not just a rhetorical slogan? Well, the way that we've chosen to address those questions is by using a power that we have under the Human Rights Act. The Human Rights Commission is established by the Human Rights Act, and the Human Rights Act sets out our functions and our powers. And one of our functions, one of our powers, is to issue guidelines on what various human rights mean. So we've invested quite a bit of time, and we've been fantastically supported by Community Housing Aotearoa. We've been supported by the National Iwi Chairs Forum. We've been supported by others in the mahi of guidelines under the Human Rights Act, guidelines on what the right to adequate housing means. So we've had a consultative process. I won't go through all the different stages of the consultation, but we've now reached the stage of we have now a draft set of guidelines and we are consulting on the draft. And I believe you've been sent the draft guidelines. If not, they are available on our website. So I'm now going to make a few remarks, general remarks about the guidelines. And then V will go into more detail when I've finished. The The draft guidelines, first of all, we're calling them not the right to adequate housing. We're calling them the draft guidelines on the right to a decent home. When you look at the international right to adequate housing and you look at many documents in the United Nations about what it means, really they're not talking about housing. They're not talking about a shelter. They're not talking about bricks and mortar. They're talking about the right to a decent home, a place where one can live happily, safely, comfortably, a place which provides the necessary infrastructure so that if living in a particular place, there's supporting infrastructure, a home which has all the necessary amenities and which is, for those who wish, part of the larger community. And a home which is understood in the context of Te Ao Maori, and a home which is understood in the world vision of other communities, Maori and other communities here in Aotearoa. A home has connection with the natural world and with broad community. It's not just bricks, mortar, shelter. So that's why we're calling the guidelines draft guidelines on the right to a decent home, not just the right to adequate housing, the right to a decent home. So this is one point that we make. We explain why we're calling it the right to a decent home. Another point we make is that to make the right to a decent home meaningful in Aotearoa, we have to locate this human right in Aotearoa with its demographic situation, with its social situation, with its cultural situation. We have to locate it in its historical location, which includes the signing of the treaty in 1840. It includes the history of colonization and dispossession of land taken from Maori for many generations. So the right to a decent home to be made meaningful in Aotearoa has to be located in our national, historical and contemporary context. And that means we have to think about colonization, we have to think about the dispossession of land. So in the guidelines, we have a section which provides some of this context, the context of colonization and titiriti. We then go into the guidelines where we identify 8 key features of the right to a decent home. And I can't overemphasize that we're not making this stuff up. There are literally thousands of publications on the right to a decent home. And what we've tried to do is identify 8 key features of this fundamental human right, which are contextualized in our situation here in Aotearoa. Now, I'm not going to go through those 8 features, but I just want to observe that one that we begin with, it's actually reinforcing that one has to be interpreting and applying the right to a decent home with a set of values in mind. And we talk about what these values are in the guidelines. So they include manaakitanga, they include mana, they include whakapapa, they include dignity and decency and fairness and quality and freedom and well-being. So we just situate the right to a decent home, not only in our cultural and historical context, we also situate them in these values. These values are the values that should inform the right to a decent home. So we talk briefly about that. And then we talk about other features of the right to a decent home, how this means that housing has to be affordable to all. Maybe not a luxury penthouse, but there is an obligation on government, to create the conditions whereby everyone can have access to affordable housing. Also, we talk about how the right to a decent home means the housing has to be habitable. It has to, comply with basic standards of hygiene and habitability and space and protection from the cold and the damp and the heat. We talk about that. We also talk about critically how the housing has to be accessible to all. Housing has to be accessible to people to disabled people. It has to be accessible to Pacific people. It has to be accessible to older people, and so on. It must be critically, I'm sure you'll be hearing about this later, accessible to disabled people. So this is a feature of the right to a decent home. Look, I'm not going to go on much longer. I just want to close by, and then handing back to Brennan, and he can do with the time as he wishes, close by saying that other features of the right to a decent home mean that policies have to be prepared in a participatory way around housing. There has to be forms of accountability in relation to housing. The housing has to be culturally appropriate so that it can take account of intergenerational living and so forth and so on. And the draft guidelines set out these key features. It also sets out what the obligations are on government and on the private sector and on individuals in relation to the right to a decent home. So we talk about obligations as well, and we talk about when there can be violations of the right to a decent home. We talk about that as well. So here we have, I'm just giving you an outline of what we call a framework. We provide in the guidelines a framework for understanding the right to a decent home in Aotearoa. It gives rise to obligations on government. It also gives rise to responsibilities on the private sector and responsibilities on individuals, in relation to which there are accountability mechanisms. I suppose the final point is this. The right to a decent home does not provide a magic solution to really complicated issues. It doesn't. But the right to a decent home, this human right, understood as set out in the guidelines, can empower individuals. It can dignify and empower communities. It can provide a way of helping policymakers do the right thing, and it can provide a way there is accountability for the promises government has made to its people. So, Brennan, I think I'll stop there, and I'm going to hand over shortly to V, or maybe I'll hand over right away to V, but I wanted to briefly speak to you all, and I'm happy to proceed as you wish, Brennan.
Kia ora, Paul. So, thanks for setting that up for us. So, hey, just a proposition, I guess, since we've been pretty casual today. I'm hoping that there might be some questions for you, but if you're able to stay with us, Paul, until after V's spoken, we could maybe just pose some questions to the two of you. Would that be all right, or do you need to rush off?
I'll have to go in 5 minutes. Obviously is in the room and she can stay much longer.
All right, well, I might just, absolutely. Yeah, so let's, I can't promise anything, but if you can stick with us, I'll just open the floor to questions or comments.
Sure.
Speak nice and clearly, it'll be awesome. So anything for Paul before he takes off?
I think that by framing the housing issue as a human rights issue, I think that helps to elevate the issue. It's a fundamental human right grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's just one point. I think that framing something as a human right elevates it. But I think also framing it as a human right means that the government has obligations. It has binding legal obligations to do stuff. But at the moment, it's not clear what they're obliged to do. So the guidelines will help the process of clarifying what the government has to do. So enable us to say to government, look, you really do have an obligation to do X, Y, and Z. And it helps apply pressure on government to do what they have promised to do. But at the moment, they're not really aware of what they've promised to do. So, and then it brings, I think, this sense of accountability. There must be, under the right to a decent home, there has to be public accountability for what the government is and isn't doing. So I could go on longer, but those are just some of the dimensions that I believe are introduced by the right to a decent home. Elevates the issue, makes specific requirements, steps that government has to take, and then requires government to be held accountable. But there are more, and I'm sure V will be able to help explicate some of the other features.
Kia ora, Paul. He whakaaro anō, he pātai anō. Diane?
Should I sit next door to that and then
sure.
hear it as well?
Diane's going to come and sit close to the computer.
Paul, thank you for your presentation. I also heard the earlier Human Rights Commissioner from overseas speaking, and glad that this is followed on from her visit. There's one thing that particularly troubles me, so I'm wondering whether the work that you're doing can address it just as soon as possible, and that is putting people who have no homes in very poor quality motels, particularly when they're vulnerable people. There are marae and other accommodation that might be used other than motels. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it troubles me as well. Look, a motel room is not a home. So for people who are having to spend any significant length of time in a motel, their human right to a decent home is not being honored. So it's very clear from the human rights point of view, a motel might be acceptable in the short term as a temporary measure for a short period of time, but it isn't a home. So putting people in a home does not fulfill, there's no doubt about this, it does not fulfill the government's obligation to provide a decent home.
Kia ora. All right, last question for Paul before he goes about his business for the day. Aaron.
See that the government accepts the guidelines.
So the question, did you hear that? So the question is, what ability does the Commission have to ensure that the government accepts the guidelines when they are complete?
They will only be accepted, I feel, if there is public support for them. The guideline power that we have under Section 5 of the Human Rights Act, it says, it's very clear, for better or for worse, it's very clear. It says the guidelines will not be legally binding. So we can't promulgate, we're not a legislature, we can't make enforceable laws or enforceable regulations. So the guidelines, I think they will depend upon, what happens to them will depend on a number of factors. It's whether or not they are shown to assist policymakers, to be a useful tool for policymakers. And we're hoping that they will be seen as a useful tool for policymakers. If they're useful, then we hope they'll be used. But also, I think another important thing is that the public have got to clamor for implementation of these guidelines. there's got to be public pressure on the government honouring them and implementing them. And I think, honestly, I'm sorry if this feels unfair, but I think that if the rights holders, that means regular people, if rights holders don't use the language of human rights and insist on them, then the duty bearers, that's government, they won't do it. So we have to make a bit of a noise and apply pressure on government to take this seriously.
I think the audience thought that was a good answer, Paul. Thank you. All right, kia ora. Anybody else quickly before Paul goes? All right, kia ora, Paul. Thanks very much for your time again. We really appreciate you joining us.
No, I very much appreciate your support, Brennan, and Car's support, and Chris and everybody else in CHA. We really appreciate it. And thank you everybody in the room there. And I now hand you over to my able colleague, V, who's working she and I work closely together on the guidelines, and I'm sure she'll be able to deepen the introduction that I've provided. But I'm most grateful to all of you. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Paul.
All right, I was hoping that I could stay sitting down because it feels quite nice to have a conversation when we're all sitting at a table together. But please feel free to interrupt me at any point to ask questions. I often struggle to remember to make questions until the end of a presentation. On that note, I think what I'm going to do to begin with is to lead off on my thoughts to some of the questions that you've asked already of Paul and provide my perspectives to add to what Paul has already said. The first question that you asked was about how the guidelines can empower people to take up their human rights or to access their human rights, including the human right to housing. And I think it's a very interesting case study. I'm glad that Paul's left the conversation because he always corrects me as to which Scottish city it happened in. But I believe it was Leith. There was a project that was done in Leith, which is called PPR. I also can't remember what it stands for, but it was about practice and participation of human rights. And what the organisation there did was that they went to a group of community residents who lived in public housing blocks, like council flats. And these housing blocks had been extremely poorly maintained for years, for decades, by the local city council. And what the organisation did was that they worked with those residents to say, you have human rights and the government is obligated to honour your human rights. And here's the language that you need to be able to use to hold them to account for that. And when those residents were able to frame the issues that they had with their housing as not just being an issue of unfairness or an issue of hygiene, because one of the major things that they wanted at the heart of it all was just to have the pigeon poo that had accumulated on their balconies for decades scrubbed off, and for there to be a regular cleaning project so that they didn't have to live in, pigeon poo and squalor. And by being able to say it's our human right to have decent housing, to have adequate housing, and that includes habitability, and you're not meeting your obligations in international law, that's when they got the change from the council. And that's the kind of thing that we'd like to see, that people can begin to use that language of their human rights to hold the people who owe them that duty to account. So that's one of the ways in which I see these guidelines as being helpful to individual people. And I hope that helps to expand a little bit on that. Paul's already touched a bit about the key features of what a decent home looks like. He's mentioned that it has to be habitable, which is probably a big thing in New Zealand given the number of leaky homes. The media that we constantly hear about mouldy, cold, damp, dirty, uninsulated housing that makes people sick. We know that it makes people sick we know the statistics. We've got doctors coming out every single year saying that it makes people sick. We've got children in hospitals because of rheumatic fever. And that means that the government and other duty bearers, including private landlords, aren't upholding that principle that housing has to be habitable. Housing has to be affordable, which means that it can't be at a level that compromises the satisfaction of your other reasonable needs. As Paul said, that doesn't mean that you should be allowed to afford, or that you should be able to afford a luxury penthouse on the average income. But it does need to be affordable, tracked against the average person's income. And that includes for tenants as well, that tenants need to be protected against unreasonable rent levels and rent increases. I recently went to a house viewing because I was curious. A property that I lived in 10 years ago that I rented in Wellington for $250 was now being rented for $600 a week. And there had been no changes made to the property. It was the same standard of living, possibly worse than when I had lived there 10 years ago. Another point is that housing has to be accessible to everyone. And accessibility means both that it's physically accessible. We know that housing by and large in New Zealand is deeply inaccessible for people who are disabled. For example, only 2%, I think the figure is, of state housing is currently accessible for people in wheelchairs, and that's not good enough. Accessible also means that it needs to be accessible for everyone. So we know that the housing crisis today isn't confined to disadvantaged groups. It affects basically everyone across society. But groups who have been historically disadvantaged or continue to be disadvantaged face even worse accessibility issues. For example, Māori people, their rate of home ownership is 28% compared to 57% for New Zealand European people. That means that housing is being able to purchase their first home or purchase their home that they live in is significantly more inaccessible for Māori people. Housing has to ensure that it's got facilities that are essential for health, security and comfort. When we looked at this, when we were beginning to draft the guidelines, we looked at it and we said, well, this doesn't really seem like New Zealand, does it? This seems like it's designed to address, slum housing in poorer countries and third world countries. The examples that the UN gives are that residents need access to safe drinking water, sanitation and washing facilities, refuse disposal, emergency services, and energy for heating, lighting and cooking. But then I thought further about it, and when people are living in garages or sleep outs because housing is so overcrowded that they can't find a flat to live in, when people in the far north are living in converted sheep sheds because they can't find housing, when people are living in caravans, or when people, as you said, Diane, are living in motel rooms long term that don't have those kinds of facilities, this is a really important feature of adequate housing in New Zealand. Another aspect is that housing must have a location aspect to it. So it must allow access to employment options, healthcare, schools, including te reo education, childcare and other social facilities. And so we see often that some people argue when it comes to the housing crisis that housing is much more affordable in rural or remote areas. And so if people want to access affordable housing, they could move out to more rural locations. But the location then can't sacrifice such that they have to spend a lot of their money on commuting. Of course, some people will want to commute, but that shouldn't be something that people have to make not by choice, just in order to access housing that they can afford. Paul's mentioned that housing has to have the respect for cultural diversity. And this, I think, is a really important element when policymakers are doing things like strategic plans and that kind of thing, as well as when private developers are considering how they're going to develop an apartment block or a piece of greenfields development. So, for example, we know that Māori and Pacific people would often prefer to live in wider intra-generational groupings. So we've got Papakainga, we've got Ainga family groups. And so housing can't always be, for example, the 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment that's designed to meet mum and one, maybe 2 kids, mum and dad, and maybe 1, maybe 2 kids. That can be part of the housing as a whole strategy, but it can't be the only way that we address affordable housing. The other element about respect for cultural diversity is that regeneration or other housing projects can't sacrifice places of special cultural significance. And we saw that played out very clearly in the discussion over Ihumātao earlier last year. The final point about housing as a key feature, and these are key features that the UN has set out as decency housing principles. They've been set out since 1991. As Paul said, we're not making this up. People need security of tenure that guarantees legal protection. So tenure places obligations on all parties, including tenants who have the responsibility to treat with respect to their landlord, other occupiers and their neighbours in the community, but it also places obligations on landlords, including both state and private sector landlords. If you get a copy of these guidelines, you can see these all set out at number 10, guideline number 10, when we release what we're calling part 1 of the guidelines later on as part of the entire framework. What we want to do is create some specific or story type telling to show you how that can be implemented in practice, how these kinds of features can be implemented across the board so that everyone across New Zealand society can access all of these key features of decent housing, no matter what their situations are. Housing as a human right obviously takes into account this idea of equity, equality, and non-discrimination. And it's really important that the government, in whatever housing strategy it builds or it creates, needs to reflect that decent homes must be accessible to everyone without discrimination, but that they may need to take effective measures to address the unfair disadvantage that some people in New Zealand already face. What I'm going to talk about now, I think, is about constructive accountability. Paul's already talked about this a bit in terms of how do we hold the government to account? How can these guidelines be used to push for decent housing? Putting out the guidelines or creating the right to a decent home or advocating for the right to a decent home, unless we have that constructive accountability, it can become what we've described in our guidelines as an empty promise. It does nothing if people can't uphold it and can't hold those duty bearers to account. So how do we undertake constructive accountability? How can the government be held accountable to these guidelines? The first point, I think, is that realisation of the right to a decent home can't happen spontaneously. It requires an overarching housing strategy. So one of the things that we're calling for through the guidelines is a strategy that operates at a higher level than just a policy or program, that engages numerous bodies, including government departments at all different levels, both local and central government, and it coordinates the wide range of laws, policies, programs and initiatives that, when together, create the housing system. Through a human rights-based housing strategy, what we'd like to see then is for individual policy setters like our local government, city councils, when they're writing their district plans, central government, for example, MB and HUD, which is Housing and Urban Development. We want to see them take into account these guidelines when they're developing their policies, and to keep the right to a decent home at the heart of their policies, rather than as an afterthought or a token gesture in, one line of the policy. We also need to look at how we can uphold these obligations, how we can make them uphold their obligations and make clear when they're violating their obligations. It would be unreasonable, of course, to expect housing as a human right to be implemented completely overnight. We're not saying that the government needs to go out and provide a free house to everyone tomorrow. The UN calls it what they call as progressive realisation, so that over time the government must always be working towards the goal. And every decision that they make in relation to housing should be working towards the goal of adequate and decent human rights-based housing. With that said, they also have what the UN again calls core obligations. So those core obligations, for example, is that the government cannot discriminate against disabled people when it is implementing housing. That's a core obligation. Another core obligation is that they have an obligation to provide adequate emergency housing for the homeless, which means that they're not meeting that obligation. That's not progressive realisation. It's not a goal that they can say in 5 years we'll have adequate emergency housing for everyone on the emergency housing list. That's an obligation that they need to meet now. Apart from creating the awareness of housing and therefore asking the public as housing rights holders to shout for it, what else can we do as a Human Rights Commission? Well, one of the things that we'd like to do once these guidelines have been finalised is next year and the year after to undertake a series of mini inquiries that look at the right to adequate housing, the right to decent housing, and say, compared to our guidelines, using the guidelines as a yardstick or a measure, where are they being met? Where are we being failed? And what could be done better? Obviously, we don't have the capability under law to say that the government must do something to make those binding recommendations, but we can call attention to it, and we can ask for people to bring us the evidence of their housing situations. The reason that we'd like to run them as a series of mini inquiries is so that we can focus on specific elements of housing. For example, on emergency housing and whether it's being provided adequately. Are motels adequate as decent housing for people in urgent need? We know that they're not, but providing a mini inquiry that looks into that will give us the opportunity to take evidence in a really methodical and systematic manner and put that out in a report. The same goes for housing for disabled people. If we can focus on housing for disabled people, we can look at where it's being achieved, where it's not being achieved, which unfortunately I think we're going to hear from Robbie is far more likely and far bigger, and what can be done to change that. We don't know yet what subjects we're going to focus on for those mini inquiries. We certainly have some ideas, but we'd be really interested in hearing your suggestions. And we'd also be interested in hearing your suggestions on where you think these guidelines are good, how you think they could be made better, what kind of illustrative material you'd like to accompany them, like the story-based scenarios that I mentioned earlier. How can these guidelines be used, or how can you use them to make them work for you in whatever capacity you're working in, whether that's in local government, in advocating for people in community housing, in providing emergency accommodation, or simply as someone who wants to buy their first home and absolutely cannot afford because I know that I'm in that boat. So we've got these guidelines. They're available for comment. You can download them off our website. We've got hard copies thanks to Brennan's printing. Please do feel free to read them and to provide us your feedback. We can take it by email. The email is writetoadecenthome@hrc.co.nz. And if you don't have any feedback, but you just want to know more, or you have questions that you think that they don't answer, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Do you want to just take some questions?
Yeah,
if anyone's got
absolutely.
questions, or we can...
Do you have an indicative timeline from there?
Yeah, we do. So the consultation period finishes on the 21st of December. And after working through the feedback that we get and working with our partners, including the National Iwi Chairs Forum, we'd like to have the final guidelines adopted by the HRC board in February or early March next year.
Ka pai, ka ono. Kia ora tātou. Kia ora B.
Kia ora.
Thank you very much. You'll be staying with us for the afternoon, so
Yeah.
participate in the Q&A or discussion later on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Robbie, you with us, mate?
Lauren.
Ka pai. Kia ora. Well, I'll pass over to you. Sorry, I think we're just going to stick without our cameras on. Oh, well, you can give it a go with your camera on if you like, love.
I'll give it a go because I got a PowerPoint.
Oh, dear me.
So if it doesn't work, then you just
I'll do it.
a buzz.
Ka pai, go for it. Kia ora, everybody. This is Dr. Robbie Francis Watini.
All right, have you got that?
Hi.
Cool. Oh, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me along today to I guess, cast a bit of a disability lens over the right to a decent home and I guess to tautoko the guidelines that have been put out by the HRC. And really, you can tell that Paul and I are cut from the same cloth because we pretty much prepared the same presentation, except mine's through the disability rights lens, but it's perfect. It segues right into what I wanted to talk about today. So I'm actually going to not spend too much time on the first couple of slides that I've prepared, because I think Bea has done the subjects justice and a really good job at, I guess, providing the foundation for what I wanted to share. But just in brief summary, what we're really talking about here is this set of international human rights laws that our government has signed up to. And they've signed up to a whole bunch of them. In fact, there are 9, I believe, that mention specifically the right to adequate housing, including the ones that we've discussed today, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Yet, as Bea and Paul have said, despite the importance of adequate housing, or as has been termed through the guidelines, the right to decent housing, despite this such important concept, globally, over 1 billion people are living in inadequate or non-decent housing conditions, and a whole bunch of those people live in Aotearoa. So it got me interested. What does this term adequate mean? Because what adequacy is in one community is totally different in another community. I mean, just in our recent history, disabled people were segregated from the population and put into institutions, and that was considered an adequate approach to putting a roof over our community's head. Actually, I haven't even introduced myself. I should introduce who I am and where I'm from. So I am the senior researcher, disability rights researcher at the Donald Beasley Institute. I have lived experience of disability, and I am the project lead for the disabled person-led monitoring of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And the first rights violation that we looked at was the violation of the right to adequate housing. So this is something that I've put quite a bit of thought into and talked to a lot of people about. And while I won't be talking specifically about the report today, because it's not two reports actually, one that focuses entirely on family whānau of people with multiple and complex needs, and then another report that focuses on a wider scope of disabled people. I will give an overview of some of the things that I've learned along the way. So coming back to what does adequate mean? Well, as Lee explained, the UN has actually brought together experts to discuss what they consider on a global scale what adequate means. What does it mean to have a decent home? So she took us through the different areas. So I'm not going to go into these, but they covered habitability, affordability, the availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure, security of tenure, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. So if we skip forward a bit, because I don't need to explain those now, the question remains, what do these criteria mean for disabled people in Aotearoa? Well, it's no secret that disabled people are amongst some of the most marginalised when it comes to accessing the right to adequate or decent housing. The United Nations defines disabled people as people with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So here in Aotearoa, disabled people make up 24% of the population. It's almost a quarter of our entire population. We are the largest minority. And as has been stated, even though we are the largest minority, it's estimated only 2% of our housing stock is accessible. That's what it's thought to be in the public housing sector, possibly up to 5% when private is included as well, but we just simply don't know. But we do know that 1 in 6 people need a modified living environment in order to meet their needs. Further to this, disabled people are more likely to spend more time at home, whether that's because of the lack of access or inclusion within their communities, or it could be health needs. They spend more time at home than the average person. We also know that disabled people often have quite a high number of paid support staff entering and exiting their home. So how we understand what housing is quite unique, and there's a lot of moving parts here. It is quite complex. So when we talk about accessibility through a disability lens, we're not just talking about navigating a physical space. We're also talking about financial accessibility or affordability. We're talking about psychosocial accessibility, mental access, and access to information. So for example, disabled people experience some of the highest rates of unemployment amongst any sector of New Zealand society, and those who are employed earn less than their non-disabled peers. There's also a discrepancy in how much disabled people receive according to the cause of their disability. And recent research, you might have seen it in the news, showed that Pacifica and Māori receive less in disability-related welfare than any other ethnicity. So when we consider these moving factors within the context of housing, disabled people are at both a socio and an economic disadvantage. And what this means is that we're often forced to compromise between safety and affordability. So many cannot afford to live in accessible homes or spaces that are physically or emotionally safe. So this puts us at greater risk of injury and further lifelong disabilities and psychosocial well-being. And then there's information, access to information. So for many people within the disability community, information around tenancies, sales agreements, complaints processes, or even the fact that we have housing rights at all, this information is simply inaccessible. And this is particularly relevant for members of the deaf community, the blind and low vision community, people with psychosocial disabilities, and people with intellectual or learning disabilities. For people with multiple and complex disabilities, they often require medical equipment, hoists, hygiene products, or other devices that need to be stored somewhere in and around the home. They talked about, the 2-bedroom house for ma and pa and maybe 1 or 2 kids. It simply isn't big enough when you have have to store these these things that people rely on in and around the home, often creating hazards and quite dangerous living circumstances for entire families and whānau. I know personally several people who live in spaces where they cannot physically access their bathroom. So they need to sponge bath in their backyard with cold water, or travel to their local gym or their workplace simply to have a shower. Many disabled people talk about not being able to exit their homes in an emergency, with many landlords taking an attitude, well, tough luck, when it comes to their disabled tenants. For people who experience psychosocial disabilities or mental illness, they often feel forced to hide their diagnosis out of fear of being denied a tenancy application. For people who use devices such as a walker or a wheelchair, landlords have been known to be less likely to rent the house to them because they're perceived at a higher risk of damaging the property. When it comes to home modifications, there is a significant discrepancy between what Ministry of Health will pay and what ACC will pay for. So for example, for me as a Ministry of Health client, I used up my one allocation of funding for a handrail in my childhood home, and that was 20, 30 years ago. So any home modifications that I need to make from here on out for my own safety within my own home has to come out of my own pocket. New build houses and land and house packages, Kiwi build developments, are being constructed without step-free access or toilets or bathrooms on the ground floor. Not only does this exclude disabled people from accessing these initiatives, but for those who can manage stairs, they're not able to have their disabled friends over who can't access that property because they can't use the loo, or even grandma and granddad who might not be able to navigate the stairs up to the top floor. We have a joke amongst our friends anytime we go out is pee before you go, because you just don't know that you'll be able to use the loo in any space you go to. And that includes going to friends' houses. We know that many people on the housing register also live with disability and health conditions. Disabled people are likely to be beneficiaries. And while Kāinga Ora have some accessible homes, the way in which they allocate the housing doesn't necessarily always prioritise disability and accessibility, but instead it considers other factors such as children. So a family who might be placed in a wheelchair accessible Kāinga Ora home ahead of a wheelchair user because they don't have children. And while we appreciate the care provided for our tamariki, and this is so important, the lack of accessible housing stock means that disabled people on the waiting list cannot access accessible public housing when they need it most. And I think there's this sense of exhaustion amongst our community. Fighting for your rights while you are disabled is exhausting. It also places the responsibility on an already marginalized population to lift themselves out of the situation, rather than it being on the responsibility of people in positions of power who created those systemic barriers in the first place. So while there's many wonderful, wonderful things about living with disability, and I'm so incredibly proud of my disability identity, it can be extremely difficult. It can be painful. It can be very, very uncomfortable. It's costly and it's tiring. So while we talk about being the world's largest minority, the inherent pains and discomfort many of us experience is not necessarily inherent to other communities. And this adds another layer of complexity to it all. And then you add the experience of intersectionality to disability, and these challenges are compounded. So in this section, just on a final note, I also noticed that our community has developed an internal coping mechanism that I call an attitude of gratitude, which sounds nice on the outside, But after telling me about their atrocious living conditions, most people will always follow this up with, I'm just thankful for what I have. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to complain because there is a deep-seated fear that they will lose the little that they've already got. So in summary, when I look back at those 7 criteria that we've talked about today for housing to be adequate or decent, I can say with total confidence that a large proportion of our community live in places and spaces that fail to meet most, if not all, of the criteria for adequate housing. So just to end on, to put this into perspective, as we said, these criteria came about in, I think you said 1991, didn't you? And there have been subsequent commentaries, conventions, different guidelines that have come since that have absolutely clarified the importance of accessibility and ensuring that housing is responsive to the needs of the disability community. So if we start with probably the most well-known one at the top there, it's the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article 1 requires the Government of New Zealand to promote respect for disabled people's inherent dignity. Article 9 further demands that the Government of New Zealand finds ways to identify and eliminate obstacles and barriers to accessibility, including to housing. Article 12 recognises that disabled people enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others and requires the Government of New Zealand to take appropriate measures to enable disabled people to exercise legal capacity. And Article 28 recognises the right of disabled people to an adequate standard of living for themselves and their families, including adequate housing, and demands that the Government of New Zealand take appropriate steps to safeguard and promote the realisation of this right without discrimination on the basis of disability. For instance, by ensuring that disabled people have access to public housing programs. But if you trace it back even further, the UN also has provided comments that clarify what a right to adequate housing means for disabled people. So in 1991 and 1994, they confirmed that adequate housing must be accessible to those who are entitled to it. Disadvantaged groups must be accorded full and sustainable access to adequate housing resources. Thus, such disadvantaged groups as the elderly, children, the physically disabled, the terminally ill, HIV-positive individuals, persons with persistent medical problems, the mentally ill, victims of natural disaster, people living in disaster-prone areas, and other groups should be ensured some degree of priority consideration in the housing sphere. Both housing law and policy should take fully into account the special housing needs of these groups. Within many states' parties, increasing access to land by landless or impoverished segments of the society should constitute a central policy goal. I mean, that's in 1991 that they were saying that. And I don't see evidence of this. Or maybe there is talk of it, but the proof is in the pudding, and I tell you, it's not very impressive. In 2019, New Zealand had its Universal Periodic Review, and it was recommended that the government continue its efforts in increasing the availability of quality, affordable housing and to ensure equitable housing for the elderly, disabled people and all ethnic groups. Then, of course, we had the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing visit us in February this year. Feels like a lifetime ago, but nothing's changed. Ms. Fahar said, in addition to this, persons with disabilities face discrimination from landlords, this is in New Zealand, when applying for rental properties due to the perceived risk of property damage. And there appears to be a discrepancy between funding models, which provides different levels of home support and housing modifications based on the cause of disability. This calls into question the New Zealand government's obligation to progressively realise Articles 19 and 28 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Then if we look to the Sustainable Development Goals, Development Goal number 11, commentary has confirmed that we must develop national policies and laws that guarantee access to adequate and affordable housing for persons with disabilities. And finally was the new urban agenda at Habitat 3 in Quito, Ecuador, which was in 2016. Again, states parties of the UN committing to placing a focus on ensuring that housing in cities are responsive to the needs of the disability community. So it's there, the writing's on the wall. We've been told for many, many years what adequate housing is and where the priorities need to be. And I've focused on one area today, and that's the experiences of disabled people. But as I alluded to, we are not seeing it implemented in real life. And there continues to be violations that are just absolutely heartbreaking for our community. And until we address these in a real and meaningful way, we're not going to be able to shift the housing crisis of Aotearoa. So I think I'll leave it there, but I do invite questions and feedback. And yeah, thank you for having me contribute to this conversation.
Kia ora, Robbie, thank you. Anyone got a question for Robbie? Can't find him. All right, well, we'll move quickly on then to our, well, I was going to say our last speaker, but hopefully there'll be some questions and discussion afterwards. Aaron Hendry from Lifewise. Aaron, I'll let you take care of your own introduction, mate, since we've never really met.
Kia ora team, how are you doing? Yes, it was late Thursday afternoon where I got the call. Chatted on Friday, I was on leave, and here I am this morning. So, yeah, great to meet you, mate, and great to be here today. So yeah, I'm from Lifewise. I am the team leader of the Lifewise Youth Housing Service. So we support rangatahi that have experienced homelessness. We do that by supporting them into housing and then providing wraparound support to support them to stay housed. We'll talk a bit about that. And I'm also a member of Manaki Rangatahi. Manaki Rangatahi is a collective of people within Tamaki, which are working to end youth homelessness, both NGOs. We also have advisors from MSD, good old Ian Goodall, sitting on the back here who supports us, and others, all working together around that common goal of ending homelessness for rangatahi, developing a strategy, some of the stuff we've talked about today already, to end and address youth homelessness, and basically pooling our energy and our resources to I guess, solve this issue. So yeah, I mean, I'm aware that we've been sitting for a little while, so I'm more than happy to do a bit of Q&A as we go. There's so much that could be discussed on this space, and I'm happy to take some questions as they come and just respond to those. So yeah, I guess I'll be speaking mostly around youth homelessness, how that sort of connects to poverty, and then obviously the right to housing. Cool. So yeah, let me up as we go. I guess the first question that comes to mind is, do young people have a right to a home? I think in our minds we would think yes, they definitely do, but in reality that's not the case. And I just want to reflect on a story that actually got me to where I am today. Back in, I can't remember now, 2014, 2012 maybe, a while ago, I met a young woman, 16 years of age, who was living on Queen Street. She was there because her home wasn't safe. She was being abused at home. The street was the only place she knew to go. She couldn't go anywhere else. She was whānau, there was no support. Tried to go to WINS at that time. She was just too young. There was too many barriers. Didn't get the support she needed. And she ended up living on our streets. As her period of time grew, she developed some pretty serious mental illnesses and addictions, which even further cut down her barriers to accessing housing, because now, well, you know, you've got an addiction, you've got a mental health issue, go get those sorted, and then you can have a home. She stayed on the streets until she was old enough to access an adult homelessness service, because at the time she was too young to access those adult services that had been set up. And then, you know, she'd been able to be housed and supported. But she had to wait until she turned the magic number of, I don't even know what, before she was able to be accepted into these services and then housed. I know of another young woman who, her whole whānau for generations have been homeless. They are a Māori family out in West Auckland. They travelled from home to home, Rānui Massey, did the loop, until she got old enough to realise that actually her whānau getting housed really depended, as she had grown, on there being enough space, and being the oldest and there being kids as well. She decided at the age of 15 that she'd leave home. She'd leave the tribe, I guess, and go find her own way. She ended up couch surfing herself, spending time on our streets, and experienced some really intensive trauma and abuse and neglect as a result of it. She was in that situation where she made that choice for her siblings, for her mum, because that was all she had. And then we come a bit closer to home, and I reflect on COVID-19. When we came out of lockdown, I had about 3 or 4 young people walk into my office, some of them we'd never met before, and ask for a home. They had not been able to access housing over the lockdown period because of their age. They would go to motels, to providers, and they weren't allowed because of their age. Once again, were declined and turned away. They struggled to get the support they needed. And so when we talk about a right to housing, as we've also heard, that right at the moment is not universal. It's not fully accessible to all people. And I guess that's a problem. One of the things that we recognise at LifeWise, and something that I think a lot of us here will agree to, is that basic right to a home. And it's that housing first approach. You might have heard of housing first. Right to home is the starting, the pillar block for all of our services. And one thing that we often come up against is, within the landlord context, is that question around whether someone's fit or, I guess, recovered enough to have a house, whether they are healthy enough to be housed. And so we start with that basic human right first, because what we know, I think, is that healing is not possible without housing. Those two are directly connected. We find that a lot of our young people, when they come into our service, have experienced just years, a lifetime of trauma. They will be suffering from addiction, they'll be suffering from mental illness. And some services will say, hey, like, you can't be housed until you get that stuff sorted. We won't take you because you've got a meth addiction. Or you've got, you're on synthetics, or hey, last week you had a really serious suicide attempt and we can't manage that. And so there's already even built in, and this isn't just a government issue, this is a community one as well. Even in service providers, we have these conversations around, oh, actually, is their behaviour matching it? Do they deserve a house? Do they want to be housed? Maybe they need to actually show us that they're willing before we will house them. And obviously, there's a reality from service providers that we need to work with people and support them. But if that is the conversation that is happening, then we're not talking about a right for housing. We're saying, hey, well, you meet this bar and then we'll look after you, and then we'll make sure you get a house. And so there's a power dynamic there, even within our community providers, even within our service providers. It's something that I think that we all need to pay attention to. There's a real focus sometimes and a tendency within NGOs and within the community to put all the pressure on the government and government organisations. And there is responsibility there, definitely. But we also need to look to ourselves. How are we disadvantaging our people based on the way we think about housing, based on the way we think about addiction and mental illness? How are we restricting access to people based on the way we view trauma and behaviours that come from them? So to actually fully realise the right to housing, I think we also need to recognise the reality of trauma and have a trauma-informed approach. Recognising that actually addiction and mental illness are a key component to any sort of support that goes into housing people. Another thing that sort of came up during lockdown, there was a lot of conversations obviously around how housing as we came into the election period. And one of the things I noted specifically was we had a lot of ministers start to talk about how we're going to solve the housing crisis as we're going to reform the RMA. Interesting enough, there was this hot seat that was created. I can't remember who hosted it, but it was basically a panel where young people asked questions directly to our ministers. And one of the young people asked a question about youth homelessness and what the ministers were going to do about that. And what resulted was a 15-minute argument between the ministers around who was going to fix the RMA and who, had the best plan and how it was going to happen. And it struck me that there is, I guess, a lack of knowledge around what it takes to, one, end homelessness, but actually support people that are going through this journey. I reflected that even if we end and fix the RMA, even if we got 100,000 homes like we were promised, we would still have youth homelessness, we would still have homelessness. Because of the deeper systemic issues, the discrimination, the racism that exists in our country anyway. We know for our young people that their ability to access housing is restricted by a whole lot of reasons. One is their age. A young person doesn't just have the right to have a tenancy, they don't just have the right to have a home, both in the community sector and outside of that. So some homelessness services or housing services are restricted, they're adult-centric, they're adult-focused, and so they won't accept young people. But then there's the reality of trying to get a tenancy as a teenager. So 16 to 17, you can't sign a tenancy. So already there's a barrier there. But what we also know is we've had young people that have been in our service probably a couple of years longer than they needed to, and are still in our service now because they can't get a tenancy still, even though they're now over 18. They still can't get into a flat because they're over 18. Not because they're over 18, but because of discrimination based on their age. You know, there's this expectation that young people are going to destroy your place. There's an expectation that they're not going to be good tenants. There's an expectation they're not going to be good people to live with. They're judged as soon as they walk the door. And I think something that has to be acknowledged as well is that it's not, how to say this well, is that there is a racial element to this, right? We know that tangata whenua are far more likely to experience homelessness. At least we see that in our services. 80 to 90% of young people in our service are Māori. We also know that when you come from that background of poverty, when you have experienced severe trauma, when you've gone through that whole journey, people are scared of that, right? And then you walk in the door and you say, hey, I'm on a benefit, I've had a bit of a life experience, I'm trying to deal with that. What flat is going to accept you? Like, we really struggle with that, our young people do. And so there's a whole list of barriers for young people to access housing. And so right now, that answer, do young people have a right to housing, is just not the case. So yeah, one of the, I guess, the big issues that we talk about in the youth sector is youth participation. And what we've seen is that with no youth voice, there's been no consideration. So we've had decades basically of neglect around the development of these systems where young people just weren't considered. They just weren't part of the plans that were going forward. And I think that's similar to what we heard around the disability space as well. Once again, if that voice is not at the table, if we don't have the voices of different people and different groups at the table, then what we do is we just create solutions for the majority. And then our marginalized groups just become more and more marginalized. And some examples of this, I think, where actually there could have been a shift probably years ago now, is information that came up that young people, that we actually knew about this issue. For example, I think the 2016 census showed that over half of the population that were experiencing homelessness were young people at that point in time. So we knew that, right? That came out in the data. But then when the response was given and Housing First got launched and all these other great initiatives, youth weren't considered in that program. There wasn't that provision for their needs, even though we were seeing that they were overrepresented in the statistics. And then when the youth payment got created, you might not be aware of the youth payment. It's a youth services. It's for young people that are 16 to 17 basically for young people that experience homelessness. It was designed by the National Party. Paula Bennett led it at the time, and it had a good motive, right? It was try to support young people not to get stuck on the benefit, how to provide wraparound support for them so that they can get into education and employment. But it was framed very much around the employment education space. What that missed was that actually those young people were young people that were experiencing homelessness, and they would need somewhere to live if they were going to get into education and employment. Now that is just another example of where youth voice was missed, and if young people or those who advocated for them had been at the table during that conversation, then we could have talked about that and provision could have been put into that whole policy. And now we're playing catch up. We're working with youth services, with MSD and others to try to resolve that. But when the voice isn't there, then we make mistakes, we miss people. So, yeah, I guess just to say as we go through this, this is not just a government issue. This is one that we all have a responsibility for. Government's got some role to play, and I think what we heard around the commission there around, hey, it's up to us to actually to push that forward, to say, hey, this is what we believe, this is the sort of Aotearoa we want, and to call government to account. They will only move as fast as we make them, I believe, anyway. And so I think when these guidelines come out, I really encourage you to submit on them. But when they come out, I think we need to be thinking strategically around how we begin that conversation, how we keep the energy up around ensuring that there is a right to housing for every single person, and how we ensure that all of our voices are at the table as we have these conversations. Cool. I guess just this one thing I just want to finish on, and then, yeah, if you have any questions, is, I was just reflecting as the conversations have gone on around our obligations under Te Tiriti, to ensure that there is housing for everyone. And I just had a crazy sort of moment a few weeks ago, I think, where a young Māori woman came into my office. She was only, I think she just turned 19. She'd been homeless since she was 16, living on the streets, living in motels, her and her partner. And she came and asked me for a home. And I just reflected on the lunacy of that, the fact that this is a country which is Māori's by right, yet I have a young woman who's asking me, a Pākehā man, for her birthright. And I think that needs to inform and drive our conversation as we go forward. Because I still get this sense that housing is an issue we're talking about. We don't have the urgency behind it. If this is a human rights crisis, then we need a crisis response. We saw during COVID-19 the ability to move when people's safety was at risk. When we needed a response, we needed it now. Government machinery could move quite fast. Yet we have a crisis going on that's been going on for generations. We've had a pandemic of poverty in Aotearoa for generations, and we can fix it and we can solve it, and we know some of the solutions. We know that we can work it out, but we don't have the urgency behind it. And so the reflection for me is how do we push that lever? How do we continue to create that energy and keep our government, but also ourselves to account to say, hey, this is a crisis. This is people's lives. This isn't just some policy that's going to get dusty on a shelf, right? And what brings that home to me more than anything is a young woman that has been living on our streets for years now, who we weren't able to house, who passed away only probably a few months ago, died due to her mental illness. And I remember that story in her life and the whole ways we all failed her. And I think it didn't have to happen. If housing was a basic human right, we all knew that, mission ourselves, we're doing what we could to support it. We didn't have the housing, the infrastructure set up to support her with her needs. If housing was a basic human right, then we'd get it done. We'd fund what needed to be funded. We'd get the houses we need. We'd provide that wraparound support for whānau who really need it. We don't recognise it as such in this country yet. And I dream of the day when we will. I guess that's me. Any questions?
So you've had a good read of the guidelines.
Yeah, I've had
read it. You've had 3 days.
Yeah.
Do you? I mean, you're asking whether Paul felt, or how Paul felt they enabled us to go forward. But do you see them as useful for yourself in your own practice? That's, for example, in your relationship William SD?
Yeah. So yeah, I do need to do a thorough read through, so I'm mixed up the words now. But I guess like where I see the value is in having something to aim towards, right? And having something to keep both ourselves and others accountable. I think about ourselves also focusing at home first in the NGO space. Do we live by those guidelines? Do we actually embody them ourselves? Do our services line up and match that? Because if it does, then that will start to impact the government systems and others, right? And then once we got it right within ourselves, then there's that room to say, hey, this is what's best practice and this is what we should be doing. And putting that to our partners in the government space. Yeah, and I think bringing the stories into this corridor is really important because, like I said, it's not just policy, these are real people that are affected by this. After I finish this, we're trying to find a house for a 19-year-old pregnant woman, you know, like she's in a hotel right now and she's super dangerous and unfit and she's scared for her life. Those are the stories. Another 17-year-old living down on K Road here that's just reached out for help. 17 years of age. Can you imagine yourself at 17 and where you were and what you would do if you had nowhere to go, if you're living on our streets? Yeah, I guess whatever your space is, whatever's brought you here today, have a think about how you frame this conversation and how you can use it, you know, alongside the guidelines to, I guess, start to bring the voices of our people to the front, because that's what's going to shift the dial on this.
And that's where the intersection and other rights comes into play as well. Robbie's talked a lot about the rights of disabled people, you know, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Disabled People, but this, you know, the conventions on the rights of the child. Children's human rights are that they have the right to safe housing, to housing with secure tenure, where they're not being moved every 6 months or going to a new school every 6 months. These are fundamental human rights that are bedded in on top of the right to housing. You can't ensure that a child has access to their right to education if they don't have access to the right to housing that keeps them safe and secure enough to be able to go to school, the same school every day, for a long enough period of time that they can actually start learning.
Well, kia ora tātou. Thanks for coming down. We'll wrap up the session. I've got no idea if anyone online had any questions. I haven't got anyone giving signals. But I will take the liberty of giving of some final words, if that's okay. So, and I'm really interested, Aaron, because you're just kind of this conversation about, it's not up to the Human Rights Commission to tell us what to do with these guidelines, right? We've got to do that for ourselves, and a part of it's framing up our own work and talking about our own work in the right way. And I'm pretty committed to that myself. And so there's a couple of things I'd like to share. One is I'll go so that I can have a dramatic end. Go with the most boring one first. So, and this took me back. Actually, I needed Paul Hunt to remind me of this because I studied international human rights in, I think, like 1999 or something. So, it's really nice to engage with Paul early in this process. And just a reminder that, when a government signs up to an international agreement, all of those agreements are couched in the words of respect, promote, and fulfill. Most of them, not all of them, but that's basically the premise of the government's obligations when they sign an international obligation. And they're really specific, beautiful words, so you've got to respect the rights in this agreement. So you can't publicly deny them, you can't publicly diminish them, you've got to respect them, You've got to promote them. So when you're writing a piece of tenancy legislation or amending the RTA, or when you're talking about inclusionary zoning, you've got to promote the rights in this agreement. And I'm not saying the government's doing this, but this is some of the language that we can use, right? You've got to promote these rights. So when you talk to developers, or when you talk to landlords, you've got to say, you understand that there's a set of rights over here, right, that we're obliged to as a country. It's not just the government, it's us as a country. So respect and promote and fulfill. I mean, fulfill is the easiest one, right? You've got to fulfill these rights. So when you've written that new Residential Tenancies Act, you don't just put it on the shelf, you fulfill the rights and obligations that you've intentionally put inside there. So that's one part of the language that I really like about it. The second one is, and I find this really powerful too, is that the right to a decent home, as it's couched in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, is I don't actually know that housing occurs in the Universal Declaration, right? Because the Universal Declaration, and I'm not speaking as I don't work for the Human Rights Commission, so you cannot. They're not responsible for what I'm saying. It's about the right to dignity, actually, the Universal Declaration. It's about the right for people to live in dignity. And a drop down from the right to live in dignity is the right to an adequate standard of living. And the drop down from the adequate standard of living, amongst other things, is the right to adequate housing, the right to a decent home. And I just love the idea. It was a bit of an aha moment when I suddenly went, okay, so I'm thinking about all this housing stuff, and I'm thinking about quality, and I'm thinking about tenancies, and then I thought, wait a minute, if I think about all of that through the lens of dignity, I understand it heaps better. It's heaps less theoretical. It's real. It's like I can see a family. I can see families, and I can make guesses about whether their house is insulated or whatever. But I can also see families, and I can see that they're not living in dignity. I wonder why that is, and I wonder what we need to do to help. So I think that dignity frame is really interesting as well. And so the final thing is I read, and I just really take my hat off to Paul and the team for having a really good nudge at framing up a way to understand the treaty through a human rights lens and to understand human rights through a treaty lens. It's tricky. But what I like about it is that it kind of puts this quite warm human rights lens over the Treaty of Waitangi. And a part of that conversation is about acknowledging the role of colonisation, which you've also touched on, Aaron. And what we're really talking about when we talk about that is actually the crisis, the housing crisis that we've got at the moment, insofar as it applies to Māori, is really a characteristic that comes out of colonisation. But I think what's important to also acknowledge is that poverty has the same characteristic in New Zealand. Poverty also can be most easily traced back to colonisation. So the inequity that is poverty in New Zealand, which is prevalent for Māori, much more prevalent for Māori than it is for others, in terms of the demographics, in terms of the sociology, in terms of the resource sharing, in terms of equity, that all started at the same time, which was the period after the Treaty of Waitangi. And it didn't just start in that and end at that time. It of course started at that time and continues. So I completely agree with you, Aaron, and I actually really enjoy the analysis in these guidelines of these issues. I think it's I'm sure I was one of many voices challenging you guys to get down into the nitty-gritty on how you're going to talk about the treaty in the context of the guidelines. So hats off to you, B, and yeah, so finally, and just to add to it, you know, Aaron's been encouraging you to do a few different things, but yeah, I mean, please give feedback to the Human Rights Commission, because I know from being in a similar position, good feedback's okay as well. So if you think they're great, please tell them. And if you think there's some things that need to be improved, you know, obviously they're totally open to that. And then, you know, I think it's incumbent on us to reconvene somehow next year and start talking about how we put them into practice. So,
yeah, please do give us feedback, because otherwise Paul and I will have nothing to do over the Christmas holiday. We're forced to actually have a holiday.
Short feedback, okay. All right. Any other questions, comments? Ka pai.